Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history. Stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. In the remote valleys of the Ozark Mountains, where morning mist clings to ancient ridges and shadows seem to move with a life of their own, there exists a hollow that locals refuse to name after dark. They call it Red Hollow, though few remember why the earth there runs crimson when the rains come heavy. But in 1866, just as America was trying to heal from the wounds of civil war, the people of these isolated hills whispered of something far more terrifying than any battlefield ghost. They spoke of Ada Clay. On nights when the wind carried strange sounds through the trees, sounds that weren't quite animal, weren't quite human, the mountain folk would bar their doors and speak her name in hushed tones. Children were pulled close to the fire. Livestock was brought inside. And somewhere in the darkness of Red Hollow, mysterious lights danced between the trees like spirits celebrating some unholy ritual. The locals claimed these weren't ordinary lights. They pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm, appearing in patterns that defied explanation. Some said they heard chanting carried on the night wind, words in a language that predated the settlements, predated even the Cherokee who once called these mountains home. And always, when morning came, there were signs. Livestock found dead without wounds. Crops withered overnight despite healthy soil. Women who had been with child would wake to find their hopes dashed by forces beyond understanding. This was the world of post-Civil War Arkansas, where the boundary between civilization and wilderness remained razor-thin, and superstition filled the gaps that law and order couldn't reach. The Ozark Mountains in 1866 were a land caught between worlds. The war had ended, but its scars ran deeper than any battlefield. Communities that had been fractured by conflict now struggled to rebuild, while suspicion and mistrust poisoned relationships that had taken generations to build. In places like Fayetteville, Arkansas, and West Plains, Missouri, the formal structures of society were slowly reasserting themselves. But in the remote hollows and hidden valleys, a different kind of order prevailed. Here, where the nearest neighbor might be miles away and the nearest lawman even farther, people relied on older ways of understanding the world. The weak federal presence meant that justice was often handled by community consensus, and that consensus was heavily influenced by fear, superstition, and the desperate need to find explanations for the inexplicable. The war had done more than divide families. It had torn apart the very fabric of trust that held these mountain communities together. Brothers had fought on opposite sides. Neighbors had betrayed neighbors. The Union and Confederate sympathizers who remained were locked in a cold peace that could shatter at any moment. In this atmosphere of barely contained violence and deep mistrust, it didn't take much for suspicion to fall on anyone who seemed different, anyone who lived outside the accepted boundaries of community life. And Ada Clay lived very much outside those boundaries. Into this world of shadows and suspicion stepped a woman whose very existence seemed to challenge everything the mountain folk thought they understood about their world. Ada Clay was not like the other women of the Ozarks. While they tended to husband and children, maintained tidy cabins, and attended church services when weather permitted, Ada lived alone in a ramshackle dwelling on the very edge of Red Hollow, where the civilized world gave way to something older and more primal. Those who had seen her described a woman of indeterminate age, She might have been 30 or 60, her face bearing the kind of timeless quality that seemed untouched by the ordinary passage of years. Her clothing was assembled from cast-offs and rough-sewn cloth, giving her the appearance of someone who had stepped out of an earlier century. But it was her eyes that people remembered most. Dark, knowing eyes that seemed to see through the polite facades that mountain society built around itself. Ada's reputation as a healer had preceded her arrival in Red Hollow, though no one could say exactly where she had come from. Some claimed she had Cherokee blood, that she carried the old knowledge of plants and medicines that the mountain people had half forgotten. Others whispered that her knowledge came from darker sources, passed down through generations of women who had learned to work with forces that respectable society preferred to ignore. Dr. Alonzo Childers, a frontier physician whose practice extended through the Missouri Ozarks, had encountered Ada on several occasions. His private journals, discovered years later, contained detailed notes about her unusual remedies, tinctures made from plants that grew only in the deepest parts of the forest, treatments that seemed to work even when conventional medicine failed. But Dr. Childers also noted something else, a growing unease among his patients when Ada's name was mentioned, a fear that went beyond the usual suspicion mountain folk held for outsiders. The problem was that Ada's healing seemed to come with a price. Those who sought her help often found their ailments cured, but they also reported strange dreams, unusual occurrences, and a lingering sense that they had entered into a bargain they didn't fully understand. Families who had welcomed her assistance began to whisper among themselves about the true nature of her powers. As summer turned to autumn in 1866, the whispers began to take on a more sinister tone. Ada Clay, they said, was not just a healer. She was something far more dangerous. The first signs appeared like a plague of doubts scattered across the valley. Farmers who had worked the same land for generations found their crops failing for no apparent reason. Fields that had been green and healthy one day would be brown and withered the next, as if some invisible hand had drawn the life from them overnight. The soil itself seemed cursed. Rich earth that had supported families for decades suddenly turned sour and barren. Livestock began dying in ways that defied explanation. Cattle would be found in the morning, lying in their pastures with no visible wounds, no signs of disease, simply gone. Their eyes would be open, staring at nothing, as if they had seen something so terrible that life itself had fled from their bodies. Chickens stopped laying eggs. Milk cows went dry. Even the hardiest goats, animals known for their ability to thrive in harsh conditions, would be found huddled in corners of their pens, trembling at sounds only they could hear. But it was what happened to the women that truly terrified the community. In a society where children represented the future and hope itself, a series of inexplicable miscarriages struck the valley like a plague of sorrow. Women who had carried children to term without difficulty found themselves losing babies in the earliest stages of pregnancy. Those who managed to carry longer would wake in the night, clutching their bellies and weeping for lives that had simply disappeared. The mountain folk were well versed in the harsh realities of frontier life. They understood that disease, accident, and hardship were constant companions. But this was different. These tragedies followed patterns that spoke of intention rather than random misfortune. And always, when these mysterious afflictions struck, someone would remember seeing a lone figure walking the ridgelines at dawn, or catching a glimpse of that familiar silhouette near the Buffalo River where it wound through the deepest part of the hollow. The old superstitions, half remembered from European ancestors and mixed with Cherokee wisdom, began to resurface. Families started leaving offerings at crossroads, bread, salt, bits of iron, anything that might appease whatever force was working against them. Hex signs appeared carved into fence posts and painted on barn doors. Women began carrying witch bottles, small containers filled with pins, herbs, and other protective items sewn into the lining of their clothing. Some of the older residents remembered stories their grandparents had told about places like Devil's Den in Arkansas, where the very landscape seemed to harbor malevolent spirits. They spoke of thin places, locations where the ordinary world pressed close against something else, something that operated by different rules entirely. Red Hollow, they began to whisper, might be such a place. And Ada Clay, with her strange knowledge and her solitary ways, might be the guardian of that threshold between worlds. As autumn deepened into winter, the fear that had been building in individual hearts began to coalesce into something more dangerous: collective panic. What had started as private whispers between neighbors evolved into open accusations. The name Ada Clay was no longer spoken in hushed tones. It was shouted in anger, spat out like a curse, repeated like a rallying cry for action. The panic spread beyond Red Hollow itself, carried by traders and travelers to the larger settlements. In the towns, where people felt safer behind their established institutions and gathered numbers, the stories took on lives of their own. Each retelling added new details, new horrors, new reasons to fear the woman who lived alone in the wilderness. The Arkansas Gazette, the state's most prominent newspaper, began receiving letters from concerned citizens demanding that authorities investigate the unnatural occurrences in the remote regions. While the paper rarely reported on such matters directly, the pressure from readers forced them to acknowledge that unusual circumstances were being reported from the Ozark region, lending an air of official recognition to the growing hysteria. Preachers, always sensitive to the spiritual temperature of their congregations, found their sermons increasingly focused on the dangers of trafficking with dark forces. They spoke of Satan's influence in the world, of how isolation and hardship could make people vulnerable to temptation. Some explicitly warned their flocks about the dangers of seeking help from those who claimed powers that belonged to God alone. The religious dimension of the panic was particularly potent in a region where church attendance was often the only social gathering available to scattered communities. When ministers began suggesting that the recent troubles might be the result of spiritual warfare, their words carried the weight of divine authority. Families who had been uncertain about their suspicions now felt justified in their fears. But it was the economic impact that truly galvanized the community into action. In a subsistence economy where the failure of a single crop could mean starvation, the continued agricultural disasters attributed to Ada's influence represented an existential threat. Families who had survived the war, who had endured the hardships of reconstruction, now faced the possibility of losing everything to forces they couldn't understand or combat through conventional means. The pressure for action became irresistible. In the absence of strong legal institutions, the mountain communities had developed their own systems of justice. These informal tribunals, composed of the most respected men in the area, had traditionally handled disputes over land, theft, and other matters that couldn't wait for distant courts to convene. Now, faced with a threat that seemed beyond the scope of ordinary law, these same men found themselves contemplating a different kind of justice entirely. Judge John F. Phillips, whose legal practice extended through the Missouri portion of the Ozarks, represented the kind of formal authority that most mountain settlements lacked. Known for his commitment to legal procedure and constitutional rights, Judge Phillips had built his reputation on bringing order to communities where might had too often made right. But even his influence barely reached into the remote hollows where Ada Clay had made her home. The informal community leaders who gathered to discuss the Ada Clay problem understood that they were operating in a legal gray area. There were no formal charges, no official complaints, No evidence that would hold up in a proper court of law. What they had instead were stories, suspicions, and the mounting pressure of a community convinced that their survival depended on action. The meetings began in late autumn, held in barns and private homes, conducted with the secrecy of military operations. The men who attended represented the closest thing to legitimate authority that Red Hollow possessed. Landowners, deacons, veterans of the recent war who had learned to make difficult decisions under pressure. But as these informal tribunals continued, their character began to change. What had started as attempts to find a legal solution gradually transformed into something darker. The language shifted from talk of investigation and due process to discussions of direct action. The question was no longer whether Ada Clay was guilty of the crimes attributed to her, but rather how the community could protect itself from her continued presence. Some participants argued for a formal confrontation, a delegation that would approach Ada directly, present the community's concerns, and demand that she leave the area voluntarily. Others, driven by years of accumulated fear and frustration, advocated for more permanent solutions. The debates grew heated, with longtime neighbors finding themselves on opposite sides of discussions that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. As winter settled over the mountains, the informal tribunals reached their conclusion. Ada Clay would be given one chance to answer the community's accusations. If she could not provide satisfactory explanations for the disasters that had plagued Red Hollow, she would be asked to leave. If she refused to go voluntarily, other measures would be taken. The decision to confront Ada directly was not made lightly, but once made, it carried the momentum of collective will that had been building for months. The night chosen for confrontation was December 21st, the winter solstice, when darkness held dominion over the land for its longest reign. Perhaps it was mere coincidence, or perhaps the men who planned the action understood, on some instinctive level, that their confrontation with Ada Clay was about more than simple justice. It was about the fundamental question of which forces would be allowed to shape their world. Ada's cabin sat in a clearing at the heart of Red Hollow, surrounded by ancient oaks whose bare branches created intricate shadows in the moonlight. The structure itself was a patchwork of salvaged lumber, fieldstone, and ingenuity, the kind of dwelling that spoke of someone who lived entirely outside the normal economy of the region. Smoke rose from its chimney in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the fire inside were being used for purposes beyond simple warmth. The men approached on foot, leaving their horses tethered nearly a mile away to avoid any sound that might alert their target. They carried torches, lanterns, and weapons, not because they expected armed resistance, but because they had no idea what they might encounter. The stories they had heard about Ada Clay suggested that conventional rules might not apply in her presence. As they drew closer to the cabin, the very air around them seemed to change. The temperature dropped noticeably, their breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The normal sounds of the forest, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, fell silent, as if the entire hollow were holding its breath. Then they saw the lights. At first, the strange illumination appeared to be coming from within the cabin itself, a warm glow that flickered and danced behind the single window. But as the men watched, frozen in a mixture of fascination and terror, the lights began to move. They poured out of the cabin like liquid fire, forming patterns in the air that defied every law of nature the mountain men thought they understood. The lights swirled and danced, creating shapes that almost resembled familiar objects, faces, animals, symbols that seemed meaningful but remained just beyond comprehension. Some of the men later swore they heard music accompanying the display, melodies that sounded like half-remembered lullabies played on instruments that didn't exist. But it was what they saw next that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. A figure emerged from the cabin, or seemed to emerge, for the witnesses were never quite sure whether Ada Clay had walked through the door or simply materialized from the dancing lights themselves. She stood in the clearing, perfectly still, perfectly calm, as if she had been expecting their arrival. In the flickering illumination of their torches and her mysterious lights, Ada Clay appeared both more and less human than any of them remembered. Her face was serene, almost peaceful, but her eyes reflected the dancing flames in ways that suggested depths no human gaze should contain. She was dressed in the same rough clothing they had always seen her wear, but somehow it seemed transformed, taking on the appearance of ceremonial robes. For a long moment, neither side moved. The confrontation they had planned, the accusations they had prepared, the demands they intended to make, all of it evaporated in the presence of something that exceeded their ability to categorize or control. Then Ada Clay spoke, and her voice carried across the clearing with impossible clarity, as if she were speaking directly into each man's mind rather than using ordinary sound. "You have come," she said, "seeking answers to questions you don't understand. You blame me for the failures of your crops, the sickness of your animals, the sorrow of your women. But tell me, what makes you think that any of this was ever yours to control?" The spokesman for the group, a farmer named Thomas Whitmore, whose family had lost 3 consecutive harvests, stepped forward with his torch raised high. "We know what you are," he declared, his voice carrying more bravado than conviction. "We know what you've done to our valley. Leave now, and we'll let you go in peace." Ada's response was not words, but laughter, not the cruel mockery they might have expected, but something that sounded almost like pity. "You poor, frightened children," she said. "You see darkness in every shadow, evil in every mystery. You cannot imagine that the world might contain forces that operate beyond your understanding without being malevolent." She gestured toward the lights that continued to dance around the clearing. "What you call witchcraft, your Cherokee predecessors called medicine. What you call curse, your own ancestors might have recognized as wisdom. I am what I have always been, a keeper of old knowledge in a world that has forgotten how to listen." But Thomas Whitmore and his companions were beyond reasoning. The months of fear, the economic desperation, the social pressure to act, all of it had brought them to a point where Ada's words, no matter how compelling, could not turn them back. "Enough!" Whitmore shouted, and the spell of the moment shattered like glass. What happened next would be debated and reinterpreted for generations, but every witness agreed on the essential facts. The men rushed toward Ada Clay with their torches, intending to set fire to her cabin and force her to flee. But as they approached, the lights that had been dancing peacefully around the clearing suddenly flared with blinding intensity. The cabin erupted in flames that burned with colors no natural fire should possess. Blues and greens and purples that painted the clearing in otherworldly hues. The heat was so intense that the men were forced to retreat, shielding their faces and stumbling backward through the trees. But even as they watched the structure consumed by impossible flames, none of them could say with certainty what had become of Ada Clay herself. Some claimed they saw her silhouette moving within the fire, untouched by flames that should have reduced her to ash in moments. Others swore they witnessed her form dissolving into smoke that rose toward the stars with purposeful direction. Thomas Whitmore, who had led the confrontation, would later tell his family that in the final moments before the cabin collapsed, he had seen Ada Clay standing in the doorway, surrounded by fire but completely unharmed. She had looked directly at him across the burning clearing, and in her eyes he had seen not anger or hatred, but a sadness so profound it had brought tears to his own eyes. Then the roof collapsed, sending sparks and embers high into the winter sky, and when the flames finally died down in the early hours of morning, nothing remained but a circle of blackened earth and the lingering scent of herbs and smoke. Ada Clay's body was never found. The immediate aftermath of that terrible night brought no relief to the people of Red Hollow. If anything, the destruction of Ada Clay's cabin seemed to have made things worse. The men who had participated in the confrontation returned to their homes as changed men, carrying with them a burden of uncertainty that would weigh on their consciences for the rest of their lives. Within weeks of the burning, new and more disturbing phenomena began to manifest throughout the valley. Residents reported seeing a woman's figure walking the ridgelines at dawn and dusk, always at a distance, always just familiar enough to send chills down their spines. The apparition never seemed to acknowledge the observers, moving with purpose along paths that only she could see. The mysterious lights that had danced around Ada's cabin on that final night now appeared throughout Red Hollow, manifesting at random times and locations with no discernible pattern. Families would wake to find their yards illuminated by the same otherworldly glow, would peer through their windows to see the lights performing their incomprehensible dances before vanishing with the coming of full dawn. Children began reporting dreams of a kind woman who taught. To them, songs in a language they didn't recognize, songs that stayed with them after waking and seemed to carry their own power. Adults found themselves humming these melodies without realizing where they had learned them, until the familiar notes would stop them short with recognition and inexplicable dread. The agricultural problems that had sparked the original accusations against Ada continued with renewed intensity. Crops planted in previously fertile soil would emerge from the ground only to wither within days. Livestock continued to die mysteriously, often found arranged in patterns that suggested intention rather than random death. Wells that had provided fresh water for generations suddenly ran dry or turned bitter with minerals that made the water undrinkable. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the changes in the land itself. The hollow that had once been known for its natural beauty began to take on an ominous character. Trees grew in twisted shapes that seemed to form symbols when viewed from certain angles. Streams changed course overnight, carving new channels that followed no logical topography. The very ground seemed unstable, with sinkholes opening without warning and rock formations appearing where none had existed before. Dr. Alonzo Childers, making his rounds through the affected areas, documented these changes with scientific precision, but even his rational mind struggled to find explanations for what he observed. His journals from this period reveal a man caught between professional skepticism and the evidence of his own senses. The natural order appears to have been disrupted, he wrote, though by what agency, I cannot say. The people speak of curses and supernatural vengeance, but I find myself increasingly unable to dismiss their fears as mere superstition. The social fabric of the community, already strained by years of war and hardship, began to unravel completely. Neighbors who had once relied on each other for support now viewed each other with suspicion. Any misfortune that befell a family might be attributed to their having somehow earned Ada Clay's posthumous wrath. Old grudges and buried resentments surfaced as people sought scapegoats for troubles that seemed to have no earthly solution. Some families packed their belongings and left Red Hollow entirely, joining the larger patterns of westward migration that characterized the post-war period. County records from Carroll County, Arkansas, show an unusual number of property transfers during this time, with former residents selling their land for whatever they could get and moving to places they hoped might be free from the influence of whatever force now held dominion over their former home. But even those who fled carried the story with them, spreading the tale of Ada Clay and Red Hollow to new communities across the expanding frontier. As the months turned to years, the immediate terror of those events began to transform into something else entirely. The people who remained in the Ozark region found that the story of Ada Clay had become woven into the very fabric of their cultural identity, passed down through generations as both cautionary tale and strange source of regional pride. Folk singers, those traveling minstrels who carried news and entertainment from settlement to settlement, began incorporating Ada's story into their repertoires. The songs they composed transformed the terrifying events of that winter night into haunting ballads that spoke of mystery, loss, and the dangerous allure of forbidden knowledge. Each performance added new verses, new interpretations, new layers of meaning to the original events. The ballads portrayed Ada not as a malevolent witch, but as a tragic figure, a woman whose only crime had been possessing knowledge that others feared to understand. In these musical retellings, she became a symbol of the eternal conflict between progress and tradition, between the safety of ignorance and the dangerous burden of wisdom. Storytellers around campfires took up the tale as well, each adding their own embellishments and interpretations. In some versions, Ada Clay had been a Cherokee medicine woman, keeper of ancient healing secrets that the white settlers had been too prejudiced to appreciate. In others, she was a survivor of the Salem witch trials, carrying the knowledge of her persecuted sisters into the American wilderness. The story proved remarkably adaptable, morphing to reflect the fears and fascinations of each new generation that encountered it. During periods of social upheaval, Ada became a symbol of rebellion against unjust authority. In times of religious revival, she represented the dangers of straying from Christian faith. When scientific rationalism held sway, she embodied the primitive superstitions that enlightened minds had supposedly left behind. Folklorists who came to the region in later decades found in Ada Clay's story a perfect example of how communities create meaning from tragedy. Vance Randolph, whose extensive collection of Ozark folklore would eventually preserve hundreds of such tales, recognized that the Ada Clay legend had achieved something remarkable. It had become a lens through which the mountain people could examine their own relationship with the mysterious forces that shaped their lives. But the scholars who studied these stories were often surprised to discover how consistent certain details remained across different versions and different tellers. The description of the strange lights, the precise date of the confrontation, the fact that Ada's body was never found, these elements appeared in virtually every account, suggesting that beneath the accumulated layers of folklore lay a core of historical truth that resisted embellishment. More intriguingly, many of the storytellers claimed that their versions had been passed down through families who had direct connections to the original events. Children and grandchildren of the men who had confronted Ada Clay continued to share what they insisted were first-hand accounts, filtered through generations, but retaining essential details that never seemed to vary. As we reflect on the story of Ada Clay and the events that unfolded in Red Hollow during that dark winter of 1866, we find ourselves confronting questions that extend far beyond the fate of a single woman or the fears of an isolated mountain community. At its heart, this tale speaks to something fundamental about human nature, our eternal struggle to understand forces that exceed our control and our tendency to destroy what we cannot comprehend. Was Ada Clay truly a practitioner of supernatural arts, wielding powers that modern minds would dismiss as impossible? Or was she simply a woman whose unconventional life and extensive knowledge of herbal medicine made her a convenient scapegoat for a community overwhelmed by the random tragedies that define human existence? The historical record, such as it is, provides no definitive answers. What we can say with certainty is that the people of Red Hollow believed in Ada's power, both while she lived and after her mysterious disappearance. Their belief shaped their actions, and their actions created consequences that rippled through generations. In a very real sense, it doesn't matter whether Ada Clay possessed supernatural abilities. What matters is that her community's conviction that she did possess such abilities became a force that transformed their world as surely as any actual magic might have done. The tragedy of Ada Clay's story lies not in the supernatural elements that may or may not have been real, but in the very human failure of a community to bridge the gap between fear and understanding. Here was a woman who, by all accounts, had helped heal their sick and ease their suffering. Yet when times grew hard and explanations were needed for inexplicable losses, they chose to see her as a threat rather than seeking to understand the knowledge she possessed. This pattern, the destruction of those who carry wisdom that challenges conventional understanding, repeats throughout human history. From the Library of Alexandria to the witch trials of Salem, from the suppression of indigenous knowledge to the persecution of scientific pioneers, we see the same tragic dynamic playing out again and again. Communities confronted with knowledge that exceeds their current frameworks of understanding often choose destruction over the difficult work of expanding their worldview. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Ada Clay's story is how it reflects the isolation and suspicion that characterized frontier life in the post-Civil War era. These mountain communities, already fragmented by conflict and struggling to survive in harsh conditions, possessed few resources for dealing with the kind of complex social challenges that Ada's presence represented. In the absence of strong institutions, diverse perspectives, and established processes for handling unusual circumstances, they fell back on the most primitive form of problem-solving, the elimination of difference. The question that lingers, the question that has kept this story alive for more than a century and a half, is whether Ada Clay somehow transcended that elimination. The witnesses to her final night insisted that she had vanished in ways that defied natural explanation. The continued manifestations of strange phenomena throughout Red Hollow suggested that something, whether supernatural force or the power of collective belief, had survived the burning of her cabin. In the end, perhaps that's the true magic of Ada Clay's story, its ability to resist simple explanation, to remain mysteriously alive in the imagination long after the historical facts have blurred beyond recognition. She has become what folklore scholars call a persistent legend, a story that continues to generate new meanings and interpretations because it touches something deep and enduring in human experience. The people of the Ozarks still tell stories about Red Hollow, though the details change with each telling, and the original events recede further into the realm of myth. Visitors to the region occasionally report unusual experiences, unexplained lights, strange sounds, the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Whether these phenomena represent the lingering influence of Ada Clay, or simply the power of suggestion, working on minds primed by generations of storytelling, is a question each observer must answer for themselves. What remains clear is that Ada Clay, whether she was witch, healer, victim, or something else entirely, has achieved a kind of immortality that few historical figures can claim. Her story has become part of the landscape itself, as much a feature of the Ozark Mountains as the ancient ridges and hidden valleys that still guard their secrets from the modern world. In those moments when the mist rises from Red Hollow at dawn, when the shadows between the trees seem to move with purpose, when the very air carries hints of smoke and herbs and something indefinably other, one might almost believe that Ada Clay walks still among the mountains she called home. And perhaps, in the only way that truly matters, she does. For in the end, The most powerful magic is not the ability to control natural forces or peer into hidden futures, but the capacity to live on in story and memory, to continue shaping the world through the power of narrative long after the physical form has returned to dust. By that measure, Ada Clay, healer, witch, victim, legend, has proven herself to be the most powerful practitioner of all. The hollow remembers, the mountains remember, and somewhere in the space between history and folklore, between memory and imagination, Ada Clay continues her work, challenging us to question our assumptions, to look beyond our fears, and to consider the possibility that the world contains mysteries far deeper and more wondrous than our rational minds are prepared to accept. Her story ends where it began, in whispers and shadows, in the places where certainty gives way to wonder, and in the eternal human hope that somewhere, somehow, there exists knowledge powerful enough to transform the world. If only we are brave enough to seek it, wise enough to understand it, and compassionate enough to use it well. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.